Hello again, everyone. I'm going to make myself appear here. Hello, hello. Hey, so you've been doing your search, your fishing trip for the communication definitions. You've got those posted in the discussion board. The discussion's going on right now surrounding those definitions. And so, what I want to do now that you have been out on your fishing trip looking for communication definitions is I'd like to really start to dive in. I'd like to really begin to talk about how we can conceptualize communication and sort of even compare and contrast some of the things we found out on our fishing trips with some of the stuff that we might want to look at in this course. And so, one of the things that I want you to do, and so if you need to pause this screencast and go take a quick look or get it in front of you or something, I want you to get to where you can see the two definitions of communication you picked. Or if you've already responded to someone else's and you really liked theirs better than yours, which is okay. I want you to pull up one or two of the definitions that you really liked from our discussion. So I'm gonna stop for just a second, and if you want to hit pause, you can. Okay, if you didn't hit pause, that wasn't too horribly awkward, I hope. So what we're going to do is this. If you can see those definitions in front of you, I'd like you to kind of take a look at what is present in the definitions of communication that you chose. And oh, by the way, this is I treat this as kind of like a classroom lecture. So not necessarily everything that is important is going to be on the slide above my head. So you might want to take some notes while you're doing this. You might want to maybe open up a window and type some things if I say something especially brilliant that you think is, I don't know that I'll say anything brilliant, but that is useful. Okay, so what we've got here is, though, you've got your definitions up, and usually when we look at definitions in dictionaries or on the internet or sometimes even in scholarly journals, what we're going to see are some typical themes in our ways of conceptualizing communication. First of all, you're probably going to see something along the lines of conveying information from one person to another via verbal and nonverbal means. That is a good way of talking about communication. If you opened up an old textbook, you're going to see things in there that reference a communication model, which I'm actually going to talk more about in week 2. So I'm not going to do a whole lot of that here. I'm just going to kind of hit the surface of a communication model look here. Some of the other ways of viewing communication are turning thought into sound via language and stuff like that. But chances are you can look at the definitions of communication in our discussion board and at the ones that are right in front of you right now that you have up, and you can kind of see that there's going to be some sort of conveying of something to another person or a means of connecting, conveying, sending, receiving, encoding, decoding, stuff like that. Many of our definitions cover that, but and those are good definitions. They're good ways of looking at communication. There's not anything necessarily wrong with those. But if we're going to really dive into intrapersonal communication in a way that's useful and interesting, we need to go a little bit deeper. Okay, so that's why I've titled this "Going Deeper." Yeah, I'm a little obvious, I know. So here's what we're going to do here. I'm going to put up a quotation on this slide, and it's worded weirdly on purpose. And I'm going to kind of walk you through a little bit of what's behind this quotation and why it exists and where it needs to lead us as a class. Okay? So please make sure you pay attention, by the way. Your first journal entry is going to come out of what you and I are doing right now. All right? So you still got those other definitions of communication in front of you, and now I put up this weird quotation. One cannot not communicate. I know that it's a double negative. I know technically it's bad grammar, but the folks who actually put this wording on here did it on purpose, and it's because they want us to really think about this question: can a human being not communicate? Can you live your life not communicating? Well, that's a pretty obvious answer. No, you can't. People who absolutely can't communicate find ways. I mean, let's just say that my ears don't receive sound in the way that a lot of other people's ears receive sound. And so I will then learn sign language. Or if I have a hard time talking, I will find a way via nonverbal means. Or if I'm someone who's even in the position of someone like even Stephen Hawking, we find ways to share our thoughts. We find ways to communicate. So on one level, this quotation is saying, can we not communicate? And the answer to that is no. Humans have to communicate. We do. There's just something about it. We have to communicate. But there's something else as well. It, this quotation pushes us to think deeper about communication in some interesting ways. And so one of them is, and really what we need to talk about in here is the frequency with which a human being communicates. And so if you really take a look at the definition above my head, and just think to yourself for a minute, if one cannot not communicate, what does that mean about how much or how often I'm communicating? Usually when I ask students this in person, they're able to get to it pretty well. I wish I could hear your responses right now, but really what it's saying is that it's not just that I have to communicate. It's that I'm always communicating. One cannot not communicate. When you really boil this quotation down to what it is saying, it's saying that I am always communicating. Now, that is an interesting thought. You might be able to think of an example right now that says, well, wait a minute. Well, what about when I'm asleep? Am I communicating then? Well, what about if someone who's in a coma, are they communicating? What about if I just head up to the mountains and decide to live there in a solitary existence for the rest of my life? Am I still communicating? These are all really important questions, and they're worthy of us to answer. And so the truth is that in the communication discipline, there are two sides of this argument, two ways to approach how to answer this this question of am I always communicating? One side says no, I'm not always communicating. One side would say that for me to communicate, I have to, and this is going to be an important thing, I have to intentionally send a message to you. I have to intend to communicate with you so that for it to be communication. Okay, so one side says that the person who is asleep is not necessarily communicating; they're just asleep. Okay, the person who says I'm not always communicating would say, you know what, the person in a coma, they're not communicating with me; they're in a coma. The person who says I'm not always communicating, if I choose to head up the mountain and live a solitary existence, I'm not communicating. I mean, I might still communicate with myself while I'm there, but to you, I'm not communicating anything. Okay. Now to the people who are on the other side, and they say, yes, we are always communicating. Those people on that side of the argument say the person who is asleep is absolutely communicating. There's biological functioning going on between your brain and your body. You are telling me that you're tired and that you need sleep, right? If you're the person who's in a coma, you're telling me that you're in a coma. Even though you don't have to intend the message, you can still send it. And that's important here. The people who are on the I am always communicating side will say, I don't have to have intent to send you a message for it to be communication. People who say, I'm not always communicating will say, I have to have intent. Okay? So, this question of always communicating, and I'll tell you about in week 2 kind of where we're going to approach this from in this class. But right now I want you to just kind of ponder it a little bit because your first journal is going to be linked to it. But these questions of intent are important for us to ask. We have to, whether or not you're thinking right now, I agree that I'm always communicating, or you're like, I agree that I'm not always communicating. We have to ask questions of intent. So here we go. we have these questions of intent that we have to ask. And the first one is, does intent matter? And the answer is yes. Intent matters because we have to think about it. We have to deal with it. We have to answer the question of intent before we can get to the questions of meaning, which, by the way, that's part 2 in our stuff of this this lecture here. So, does intent matter? Yes, we have to think about it. You need to think about it. Between now and week 2, I'm actually going to draw out some of the ethical and moral implications of you picking one side or the other in this conversation. And then I'll tell you how we have to approach it for this class, okay? So, does intent matter? Yes, it does. We absolutely have to have intent because be a part of the conversation, okay? Then we have this next question. What is the relationship between intent and meaning, or meaning and intent? This is a really important question because is it possible for me to send you a meaning that I didn't intend to? Is it possible for you to attach meaning to my behavior, which we'll talk about a little bit, without me intending to send you a message? We find that people attach meaning to behavior all the time, whether or not I intend for it to. Now, whether that counts as communication or not depends on which side of the coin you're on, okay? The people who say I'm always communicating would say, yes, if someone attaches meaning to my behavior, even if I didn't mean to, that's communication. People who say I'm not always communicating would go, that's just you attaching meaning to my behavior, that's not communication, okay? So, but this relationship between meaning and intent is really important for us to think about. And then our last question of intent is this: does meaning necessitate intent? And that we can say no, it does not. You do not have to have intent for meaning to happen. You can attach meaning to my behavior. I can attach it to yours. If you're yawning right now while I'm talking and I could see it, I might go, oh my gosh, they're bored. They're having a really bad time. I need to do something better in my teaching or whatever. When in reality, you're not bored. You were just up late last night feeding your 2-year-old, because that's what I was doing. So we have to ask these questions of intent and meaning and how these things are connected to really begin to dig deep into communication this semester. So, folks, that's actually it for this first part. It's time for a writing break. I want you to head and take a look at your first journal prompt. Your first journal prompt is going to be you taking some time to reflect and sort of answer, do you feel like you are always communicating? I kind of want you to think about this and put yourself on sort of either side of this am I or aren't I always communicating discussion. And then it'll be a part of our discussion as we go on later in this week, and a part of what we're doing here in week 2. So head over to the journal entry prompt. You'll see it posted there for you. Take some time, answer it, and then it's time for part 2 of going deeper with communication and reality. I'll see you soon.